In 1969, twin brothers Ronnie and Reggie Kray were sentenced to life in prison for murder. In just 8 years, they had risen from small-time racketeers to become the most powerful criminal organization that London had ever seen. It was an empire based on fear, violence, and extortion. But there was another secret to their success: political corruption. Thanks to a Tory lord with a passion for kinky sex and a Labour MP with a love of cottaging, Ronnie Kray was able to make his gang untouchable. This is the story of a cover-up at the highest level of government. A story of corrupt politicians who were protected by the establishment for over 30 years. And people still being shielded today.
There's so many things that haven't come out, you know. There's so many things.
There are stories that don't get published.
These people are still being protected.
It is the story of the gangster and the pervert peer. (1963), the year that sex threatened to bring down the Conservative government. Defence Minister John Profumo had been forced to resign after lying to Parliament about his affair with call girl Christine Keeler. Low in the polls and with an election looming, the Conservatives were determined to avoid another sex scandal at all costs. They had no idea there was a time bomb at the heart of the party waiting to explode. Another Tory politician having the time of his life. In 1963, one of the best-loved and most famous politicians in Britain was Tory peer Lord Robert Boothby. His appearance on This Is Your Life was eagerly watched by millions of viewers.
This is your life, Baron Boothby of Buchan and Rattray Head, Commander of the British Empire, Doctor of Laws, Officer of the Legion of Honour, Rector of St Andrews University, once Parliamentary Private Secretary to Winston Churchill. I think that's the lot.
Yeah, except that I'm a knight.
Boothby was the top political celebrity of the late 50s, early 60s. And he was very good at it. I mean, he could talk the hind leg off a haggis. You know, he was a marvellous old...
He was a great character, a lovable rogue. He was fruity, funny.
Adolf Hitler had the pleasure of you calling on him in 19...
He'd made an immense reputation on television for his chat, and he was totally fearless and outrageous in what he said and what he believed.
He rose to his feet, clicked his feet together and said, "Hitler!" And I, for once, rose to the occasion and I clicked my feet and I put my hand up and said, "Boothby!"
Bob Boothby became a Tory MP aged only 24. As a rising star in the Conservative Party, he was close to Churchill and destined for high office. But in 1941, he failed to declare a financial interest when asking questions in Parliament. He was banished to the back benches, but remained high profile.
On the face of it, he was extraordinarily good company. He was a bonhomous character. But he was also a man who lived a double life.
Boothby's double life led right to the top. Since 1930, he'd been having an affair with Dorothy Macmillan, the wife of Harold Macmillan. The affair continued throughout Boothby's time in Parliament, even while Macmillan was Prime Minister.
It caused considerable distress to Harold Macmillan. In spite of that fact, which Boothby knew perfectly well, he petitioned Macmillan for a peerage, and actually got a peerage.
Lord Boothby's affair with Dorothy was kept from the public, but was common knowledge in Westminster and Fleet Street. Less well known was the fact that Boothby was bisexual.
She was his beard. nasty word, but it means, your alibi, if you're that way inclined. And in those days, you rather needed to have one.
She was a rather mannish-looking woman, and the legend goes that Bob was attracted to her because she reminded him of a caddy, male, whom he'd had on the golf course at St Andrews.
This is your life.
In the early 1960s, homosexuality was still punishable by a prison sentence. Boothby's admiring public had no idea the Tory Lord was secretly playing Russian roulette with his career. Journalist Michael Thornton had just started working for the Sunday Express when his editor suggested he write a piece on Lord Boothby. Thornton was about to discover not just the Tory peer's homosexuality, but his secret connection to the London underworld.
Lord Boothby was living at number 1 Eaton Square, where he had a very grand flat on the second floor. And the first thing I remember was this young man, a very good-looking young man, blonde, slim, who looked like a cross between a young Peter O'Toole and a young Terence Stamp, who emerged from his bedroom, whose name was Leslie Holt. And I said to Bob, "Who is he? What does he do? Is he an actor?" And he laughed and said, "No, he's not an actor, dear boy. He's a burglar." I said, "A burglar?" And he said, "Yes. I give him the names and addresses of people I don't like, and when they're on holiday, he goes around and burgles them." What he didn't earn from burgling, I think he earned from rich, well-heeled older men for whom he performed sexual favors.
Leslie Holt had first met Boothby at a boxing match. It was the start of an unlikely relationship between the East End cat burglar and the upper-class peer.
Boothby was in love with Leslie Holt because though he has a wife, Leslie Holt had a wife and a girlfriend who were AC/DC, and Boothby, he would introduce him to better way of life and better quality of life, and take him into better restaurants. He bought him a lovely car. It was just like a cash cow to him. But Lord Boothby was in love with him, so it suited both parties for what one wanted one thing and one wanted another thing. That's how it went on.
At Boothby's flat, Michael Thornton also encountered a more sinister character.
I was there one evening at 1 Eaton Square, and Leslie Holt came into the room at some point and said, "Shall I go and collect the governor now?" Holt came back about half an hour later with this rather extraordinary guy who was very, very heavily set. And the first thing that you noticed about him were these eyes, which were black and dead and looked like a sort of killer shark. And when he looked at you, you had a disturbing feeling that he was sizing you up for the kill. Bone-crushing handshake. And this was Ronnie Kray. Bob called him Ron, and they actually embraced. They obviously knew each other very well indeed.
So why was London's most notorious gangster greeting a Tory lord like an old friend? This was Boothby's secret. In 1963, Lord Robert Boothby was having secret liaisons with gangster Ronnie Kray. But Boothby was not Kray's only influential friend. He was just the latest in a series of politicians who became close to the mobster. All of them would eventually play a part in Kray's plans to dominate the London underworld. Ronnie and his twin brother Reggie had grown up in the poverty of the East End. They were promising teenage boxers who also enjoyed fighting outside the ring. This love of violence would kick-start their criminal careers. In 1955, aged 22, the twins took over a run-down snooker hall on the Mile End Road called the Regal. It wasn't long before they were approached by a local gang demanding protection money. Rather than pay up, Ronnie used a bayonet to impale the gang leader's hand on a snooker table. Having frightened off the mobsters so easily, the Krays decided to start their own protection racket. Over the next 5 years, the Krays acquired a gang of associates and a reputation for savage brutality.
Ronnie was particularly dangerous. There was no knowing where his temper would lead him. People were shot for offences, people were very badly beaten. Somebody said quite early on to Ronnie, you've put on a bit of weight, and Ronnie cut the man to ribbons.
By 1960, the twins ran the dominant protection racket in the East End. But Ronnie had bigger plans.
I'm going to write my name all over this town in big letters. Hey, stop it!
They saw a lot of movies about American gangsters. They knew a lot about the mafia.
Get out of my way, Johnny! I'm going to spit!
And one of the things that the mafia had always done, of course, was to get a few politicians on the payroll.
As Ronnie wrote in his autobiography, I'd read how people like Al Capone built up a lot of their power because they had friends in high places, namely politicians.
Gang war in the street.
Now Ronnie sought to bring Capone's methods to London. But where could he meet a suitable politician? The answer came in 1961, when the Conservative government passed new legislation, making casinos legal in Britain for the first time.
What sort of people are you trying to attract? We're trying to attract all sorts of kind, nice, decent, sensible people.
Suddenly there were dozens of new venues in central London taking thousands of pounds in cash every night. They were perfect targets for the Krays. With money from their East End racket, the twins acquired a base to extend their operations into the West End, a Mayfair nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn. It was to be their passport to the upper classes.
Well, there was 3 floors. The ground floor was a lesbian club, the middle floor was a rock club, and the upstairs was a plush gambling casino club. High-class people, lords went, ladies went, captain of guards. When they took over, that was all the clientele.
The Krays now realized that money could buy them class.
One of the first things they did was to get a bit of prestige and polish. And there was an old clapped-out aristocrat called Lord Effingham, and he was a drunk, and he was an old gambler, and he was right down on his luck. And the Krays put him on the board of Esmeralda's Barn.
Lord Effingham was what they call the greeter. My dear boy, how lovely to see you. Do remember to meet your mother. Come and meet my dear friend, Mr. Kray. And, of course, come and spend a few quid on the roulette tables. But in fact, poor old Effie, as they called him, really had a pretty hard time with them. They paid him 10 quid a week, something like that.
And Ron liked having this distinguished Earl as his tea boy. He used to say, Effie, go and get the effing tea.
While Lord Effingham had little political influence, his presence at the club attracted an upper-class bohemian crowd, including many openly gay men. Until now, Ronnie had been secretive about his homosexuality.
It was new then for people in the working class to be homosexual. Do you understand what I mean? It was all like the public schoolboys were all giving each other one, but a rough gangster to be homosexual, it was a bit frowned on, and they'd whisper in corners, but they wouldn't say out to Ronnie.
It was a great liberation for him at that moment. It gave Ron a very good chance to mix with that whole sort of Chelsea set, which at the time was very, very interested in crime. They were very interested in the East End.
Some of Ronnie's gay clientele had an appetite for sex with working class men, and he began supplying them with rent boys from the East End. It was this desire for rough trade sex among upper-class homosexuals which would soon allow Ronnie to corrupt his first politician.
At the ABC Cinema Mile End, they made film history by staging the East End's first royal premiere. The stars came thick and fast. They were all going
Sparrows Can't Sing was one of the first hit films to feature authentic Cockney actors. Almost overnight, the East End became fashionable, and the Kray brothers were right at the heart of it.
Quite a wonderful evening, this first East End royal premiere.
The twins had opened a new East End night spot called the Kentucky Club. It featured in the film and was the venue for the launch party. That night, Ronnie Kray was the proud host of a star-studded party. But social cachet was not enough. He was looking for political influence. And it was in the Kentucky Club he found it, when he was introduced to a notorious Labour MP called Tom Dryburgh.
It was a man who first entered it 22 years ago, was it? Labour's Tom Dryburgh.
In public, Dryburgh was a respectable and popular intellectual and journalist.
Members of Parliament need more in order to give a better service to their constituents.
But in private, like his political opponent Lord Boothby, Dryburgh was addicted to risk-taking.
It seemed that Tom Dryburgh had sexual satisfaction in toilets. He was turned on by danger of any sort. The more public place he could have the sex, the more thrilling it was to him. So you'd have sex in lavatories, even in lifts.
Men caught cottaging faced severe penalties, but while Dryburgh had been arrested several times, he relied on his status as an MP to avoid charges. And after 30 years as a top gossip columnist, he also had a powerful patron, Press Baron Lord Beaverbrook.
Beaverbrook, I was told, had a safe stacked full of cases, charges, fines that had been paid or settled for Dryburgh, scrapes that he'd got him out of. The safe was full of them.
It was also rumoured Dryburgh was working for both Soviet and British intelligence. For a man who enjoyed playing with fire, meeting a gay gangster was very appealing.
He and Ronnie had the same sexual proclivities. They were, I was going to say, made for each other in a way. Here was a long-standing MP, well thought of MP, who could be useful to them.
Dryburgh was introduced to a gay member of Krays' gang called Mad Teddy Smith.
Mad Teddy Smith, big fine lad, full of his own importance, could speak a few languages. I don't think he ever told the truth in any of them. But he was very good to meeting people for future con games.
Tom was always attracted to the idea of danger and violence. A working class boy, particularly with a criminal record, embodied all that he most enjoyed.
Dryburgh began an affair with Teddy Smith. And when Kray asked the MP to help arrange a prison transfer, he agreed.
Ronnie had gone to him and said, could he write the letter, to whoever it may be, to get one of our friends moved on compassionate ground from, because his mother and his parents can't see him, it's a long way down to Dartmoor, and within about 3 or 4 months it was in Wanworth or whichever prison he was near home. So that's the little thing that I know they got him to do.
Ronnie Kray's plans were beginning to pay off. He had friends in high places, but he wanted more. If he could find a Tory politician as cooperative as Labour's Tom Dryburgh, he would be well connected to both sides of the political establishment. In the autumn of 1963, Ronnie Kray moved into an East End apartment block called Cedric Court. One of his neighbours was none other than the cat burglar and rent boy, Leslie Holt. Ronnie became Holt's lover and soon learned he was sharing the rent boy with Lord Boothby. It was the opportunity that Gangster had been waiting for.
Ron started having sex shows in his flat in Cedric Court. In fact, Ron got the idea that these sex shows could be a source of influence, a way of getting into the establishment, and possibly a way of actually blackmailing people. They were tailored very much to the tastes of those who went. Elderly gentlemen who liked seeing young boys perform.
Men like Tom Dryburgh and Bob Boothby, who were both eager to accept invitations from their lovers, Teddy Smith and Leslie Holt.
Old Tom Dryburgh was interested. He wanted to go down on everybody. And that, I couldn't believe. You know, he just wanted to have oral sex. If you lined 10 up, he'd give all, you know what I mean? He'd give everyone head, he would. That's how he was. It's just unbelievable.
While both politicians were homosexual, Boothby enjoyed more exotic pleasures.
Well, I was informed by Leslie Holt that he was involved in what is known as scat. Scat sex. Boothby lay under a glass table while boys defecated on top of it. I would have thought it would put you off your cornflakes forever, but that's what he was doing.
The Cedric Court orgies took place while the Profumo scandal raged in the press. If any word of Boothby's sexual tendencies and gangster friends got out, it would have blown the Tory government apart. Yet the politician behaved as if he had nothing to fear, and began inviting Kray to his home and to his club. Kray and Boothby even dined together at the House of Lords. By this time, journalist Michael Thornton was a regular guest at Boothby's flat.
I was there one evening at 1 Eaton Square, and Ronnie Kray was there, and he had a boy with him who showed signs of wear and tear. He had bruises on his face and a cut lip. Looked as if he'd been in the wars. And he said, "Go on, be nice to Lord Boothby. If you're not, I'll give you an effing slap." And the boy dutifully went up and kissed Lord Boothby, full on the mouth. So I was left in absolutely no doubt at all about this situation.
The four men then moved on to the Krays nightclub, Esmeralda's Barn. Here, Thornton learned that sexual coercion was routine behavior for the gangster.
I met another of his boys at the club, and Bobby, this boy, told me all sorts of the most shocking things about Ronnie. There was a well-known boxer who had been coerced into sex by Ronnie, very much against his will. There was a well-known actor who was also not gay, who had been coerced into sex with Ronnie against his will. In fact, I believe in that case at gunpoint. And I was told by Bobby he had homosexually raped a large number of men.
While Boothby was occupied with the rent boy, Thornton realized that Ronnie Kray had an interest in him.
By this point, Ronnie was becoming tactile with me and trying to persuade me to go home with him, and I was starting to tell him 2 short words, the second of which was off. Ronnie actually got hold of me physically and dragged me into the corridor, and I was slammed up against the wall, and he actually pulled a gun on me. I heard myself saying, "Well, go on then. That will make a good story, won't it? Journalist gunned down in Krays club." I can't believe I said it. And Reggie appeared as if by magic and said, "Leave it out, Ron. You can see the kid's not interested, and he's the effing press." And Reggie then said, "Get lost. Go. Now." And stood between Ronnie and me, and I went.
Thornton had discovered what lay at the heart of the friendship between Boothby and Kray.
Ronnie provided Boothby with working class boys. He was trying to provide Kray with West End class boys, which is what I suppose I was supposed to be.
Thornton believed he had a front-page story, but his newspaper, the Sunday Express, was strongly aligned to the Tory party.
I went to my editor, John Junior, and said, "We're sitting on the scoop of the century here." And he said, "Laddie, you have things to learn. There are stories that don't get published." He wasn't about to publish a story in the Sunday Express that unseated the Conservative government. So I was nearly murdered, came close to being homosexually raped, all for no story.
The right-wing sympathies of the Sunday Express had kept a lid on the scandal. But it was only a matter of time before a left-wing and less deferential newspaper got hold of the story. (1964) was an election year.
We seek to create a Britain that is on top of its job.
As Britain prepared to go to the polls, rising gang crime was on the political agenda.
The West End has 500 nightclubs, a breeding ground for protection. Some still pay up, others are defiant.
The Krays were more powerful and confident than ever, expanding their protection rackets into the West End. But their activities were attracting the attention of the media and the police.
For Scotland Yard men who face all too often a wall of silence, the rise in violence is a constant headache. New orders have been issued in a bid to check the racketeers.
I was picture editor of the Sunday Mirror at that time. We were about to run a series of articles on the evil Kray family, the twins and their brother. We knew they were the biggest gangsters in London, but how to nail them, how to get them exposed. On the Sunday Mirror we had a splendid crime correspondent called Norman Lucas, and he got a tip, obviously from someone in the yard, that the Kray twins were having an improper relationship with Lord Boothby. Well, the editor, Reg Payne, was most excited. This was clearly a page one story, a big scandal, would run for weeks. The question was, how could he get it into the paper? The editor knew he couldn't name Boothby, and he didn't even name the Krays. He ran it as an improper relationship between a prominent peer of the realm and a homosexual thug.
Well, of course, we all knew exactly who the peer was. Everybody in London knew who the peer was and who the gangster was. The whips, I'm told, went round to Boothby, who was in a blind panic. Of course, being Bob, he denied all knowledge of it and said, complete lies, all of it's lies.
The next day, a photograph was sent anonymously to the Sunday Mirror. Boothby had allowed Kray's gang to take pictures at his flat. The newspaper now had hard evidence to support its allegations of an improper relationship.
Well, it was a picture editor's dream come true. When that picture landed on my desk, I thought, fantastic, great, here's a page one splash, because there was Boothby with Ronnie Kray and a young lad who was alleged to be a rent boy. Sensational, knockout, you couldn't beat that.
A week later, the Sunday Mirror ran the story again. For legal reasons, the photo could not be shown, but the paper's claim to have a picture too sensitive for publication caused a sensation. The Tory whips now suspected Boothby had lied to them. Terrified of further revelations and with less than 3 months until the general election, the government was starting to panic.
There had been a crisis meeting at the top of the Conservative Party with the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas-Home. Let's remember that in the previous year they'd had the Profumo scandal, and they obviously thought, no way can our government survive another of these scandals.
Boothby was on the verge of ruin. But he wasn't the only politician involved in the scandal. Rumours were now circulating in Westminster that Labour MP Tom Dryburgh had also been fraternising with rent boys and criminals. What had been a damaging story for the Conservative government alone now threatened Harold Wilson's Labour Party too.
Wilson, I'm told, vetoed any member of the Labour Party speaking out about the matter at all. So he closed ranks with Douglas Hume and the Conservatives to protect Boothby. There was this kind of inter-party conspiracy.
Boothby, the Tory, was suddenly offered the services of a powerful figure from the Labour Party, lawyer Arnold Goodman.
Goodman was right at the heart of the Labour establishment, and Harold Wilson's Mr. Fix-It. And in becoming Mr. Fix-It, he became the laboratory attendant of British politics.
With Goodman on board, Boothby sent a letter to the Times. He said he'd met Ronnie Kray just 3 times to discuss a business proposition, which he'd refused. He explicitly denied being homosexual and called the whole story a tissue of atrocious lies.
Well, it was a bit like the Pope suddenly announcing that he wasn't Catholic. I mean, something none of us took seriously.
He said he was going to the law, going to sue us for libel, and we thought, bring it on, yeah, great. We've got the picture, we've got the evidence, we've got the tip from the Yard.
The stage was set for a court case more salacious than the Profumo affair, and sure to overshadow the imminent election. But neither party was about to let that happen.
Would you believe the top man at the Mirror Group, Cecil King, bottled out, caved in, made an abject apology on the front page of the paper, and that was the end of that. And poor Reg Payne, the editor, who had all this evidence, copper-bottomed, 100% correct in the story, was fired.
Under pressure from the government and the opposition, the Mirror bosses turned their editor into a scapegoat. They blamed him for printing allegations which they now claimed were completely untrue. Boothby received £40,000 in damages, an unprecedented out-of-court settlement worth more than £500,000 today. Harold Wilson went on to win the election for Labour, while the Boothby affair was largely forgotten. But the cover-up by Conservatives and Labour had terrible consequences for those who were trying to bring the Krays to justice.
We had to drop our investigation of the Kray family, and other papers did the same, of course. If there's a libel action and you lose, then you steer clear of that subject, that story, for a long time to come.
The aftermath was so extraordinary, really. Joe Simpson, the Police Commissioner of Scotland Yard, he had actually had to deny that ever been an investigation of this thing, where in fact, of course there had been. I spoke to the man who'd done it. So what do you imagine that will do for the police force? It means that the police know damn well that the Krays were protected by the powers that be.
Scotland Yard halted their investigation and ignored the Krays for several months, until a member of the public insisted on action. The owner of the Hideaway Club in Soho made a complaint to police that the Kray twins and Teddy Smith had demanded money and smashed up his premises. These were serious charges, and the police arrested the 3 men. Held on remand and refused bail, Ronnie Kray was facing a long jail sentence if found guilty. It was time to call on the services of his tame politician.
Bob Boothby, having narrowly avoided total ruin over this, got up in the House of Lords and tabled a question demanding that the Krays should be released on bail.
Boothby was shouted down and publicly humiliated.
He was doing something which he should not have done. He knew damn well he shouldn't. It's unconstitutional for anyone in the Commons or the House of Lords to try to interfere with the behavior of the judiciary.
Boothby later confessed to Michael Thornton that he'd been acting under duress and that Kray had blackmailed him.
He said to me rather pathetically, I can't do anything, I can't do anything. You see, they've got too much on me. Leslie Holt told me, quite a long while after all of this, that they had damning photographs of him. Photographs of him naked, photographs of him at sex parties taken at Ronnie's flat in Walthamstow, photographs of him indulging in some really very extreme and rarefied forms of sex.
Despite Boothby's intervention, the Kray twins and Teddy Smith were put on trial at the Old Bailey. Accusations of witness intimidation and jury nobbling dogged the proceedings. The Krays won the case and were acquitted of all charges.
What are you going to do now that it's all over?
I like to have a bit of family life now, you know. I intend to get married in the near future. I did before this case, but it's put back over the case, and I should get married as soon as possible, you know.
Ronald, what are you going to do now?
Well, I'd like to go abroad for a short while, and then I'd like to be left alone.
But they didn't want to be left alone. With the collapse of the Hideaway trial, the Krays were no longer criminals, they were celebrities, just as they'd always wanted. Reggie got married with wedding photos taken by David Bailey, and a guest list including TV stars and even Labour MP Tom Dryburgh. Bailey then produced an iconic photo series featuring Mick Jagger, the Beatles and Michael Caine alongside the Kray twins and their brother Charlie.
I think the Krays thought they'd made it to the big time. They'd made it to the it world.
As a direct result of the Boothby affair and the failed court case, the Krays were now perceived by the police and the media as completely untouchable. Yet the public still had no idea that Boothby's £40,000 payout had been based on lies. And it was the public who would now pay the price, as the Krays ruthlessly expanded their empire.
Well, they're animals, really. Going to wear about 30 stitches.
And I see Reggie and Ronnie beat the man to pulp until he couldn't stand up.
He said, if you don't pay, he said, we're going to shoot one of your men every week.
They always did what they threatened. If they threatened to do a thing, it was done.
Seemingly above the law, the name Kray was synonymous with fear, and they became the most powerful criminal gang that London had ever seen. Ronnie had seemingly achieved his ambition to control London as Al Capone had controlled Chicago. Until now, the Krays had not killed anyone, but drunk on power and believing he was immune from prosecution, Ronnie went on a killing spree. George Cornell was a rival gangster said to have called Ronnie a fat puff. Ronnie tracked him down to the Blind Beggar pub in Bethnal Green. Without saying a word, he executed Cornell with a shot to the head. Ronnie was becoming increasingly paranoid, and the escalating violence was even starting to worry members of the Krays' own firm. Their associate Jack the Hat McVitie was paid to do a contract killing, but refused to carry out the hit. In response, the Krays lured him to a party where he was stabbed more than 50 times. The Krays had become too powerful and too careless for the police to ignore any longer. With a new commissioner in charge at Scotland Yard, on May the 8th, 1968, the Krays were arrested and charged with murder. After what was then the longest trial in British history, the Kray twins were finally sentenced to life in prison. Yet for the politicians who had facilitated their reign of terror, it was business as usual. But there was one tenacious journalist determined to expose the whole story. A journalist who is still uncovering secrets about the Krays and the establishment today.
That.
By the end of 1969, the Kray twins had begun serving life sentences in prison, and their time as London's dominant crime family was over. Meanwhile, their one-time friend and supporter, Lord Boothby, had surprised everyone by abandoning his bachelor lifestyle and marrying Wanda Senna, a Sardinian interpreter 33 years his junior.
Are you going to take back these remarks about women being a bother and a nuisance, no?
I said they were hell, you know. She's going even further.
You've now changed your mind, have you?
Looks like it, doesn't it?
Boothby's scandalous past now seemed to have been successfully buried. But in fact, he was on the verge of being exposed. In 1969, a young author called John Pearson was researching a book on the Krays when he made a startling discovery.
I used to get on quite well with the Kray's mother, Violet Kray. And she said, well, Ronnie thought you'd like to see these things to help with the book. And she produced a small brown fiber suitcase. And inside there were some press cuttings and all that sort of stuff. But there was also in it some photographs, one of which was of the old society restaurant. And there was Ronnie and Boothby with a boy.
Boothby had publicly stated he'd met Ronnie Kray only 3 times at his flat. Now there was photographic evidence of them together in a nightclub. There were also letters from Boothby to Kray dated 1963, while Boothby claimed they'd not met until 1964.
This was very specific bits of evidence which proved that Boothby had lied.
Pearson spent the next 3 years interviewing Kray associates and writing his book, while slowly piecing together the facts about the peer and the gangster.
I showed it to my publisher, and also I checked it through, as I've been seeing Boothby, I checked it through with him. Everything totally collapsed at that point. The next thing was that Lord Goodman was on the phone to my publisher saying, I think you should know that this is highly libelous and dangerous, and we will proceed against you. Next thing I knew was the book was rejected.
8 years after the scandal, Goodman was still suppressing the story. And it wasn't just Pearson's book that was cancelled.
The Observer, who were going to serialize the book, also rejected it. And I wondered why at the time. And then I discovered that the chairman of the Observer Trust was none other than the blessed Arnold Goodman.
Pearson believes the cover-up even extended to burglary.
Shortly after the Observer fiasco, we'd been on holiday and came back and found that the house had been turned over by some spooks or someone who'd been in. And a whole file of stuff I had, letters and photographs of Boothby, had disappeared. But also, and this is absolutely true, my agent told me shortly after that her office had been turned over too. And surprise, surprise, the file on Boothby had gone. Now, if you're getting this sort of top-level dirty work, what can you do? I thought it was a good world in which if you told the truth, you shamed the devil. It doesn't work like that in England, though.
While Pearson was silenced and deprived of his living as an author, the establishment figures behind the cover-up went from strength to strength. Arnold Goodman, the lawyer who kept the scandal out of the press for over 10 years, became Lord Goodman. MP Tom Dryburgh was also given a peerage. while Bob Boothby continued to be an outspoken member of the House of Lords until his death in 1986. It wasn't until all three were dead that John Pearson was finally able to publish his story. Yet the links between the Krays and the establishment have still not been fully disclosed. Today, using the Freedom of Information Act, Pearson has obtained a police file on the Krays, which has never before been accessible to the public.
Now let's see what's here. This is when the Krays were complaining about police victimization.
The report reveals that important figures within the establishment were lobbying police on behalf of the Krays.
It's painfully obvious that some of the people supporting these gangsters are well aware of the true position, and one can only assume they are receiving some reward for their efforts. Well, what all this boils down to is that there were people who were supporting the Krays, and they were being paid to do it. And these were the same people who were then writing notes of complaint to the police, saying, hands off the Krays.
But the most crucial facts within the file have been censored by the Attorney General's office.
It says that the Krays are supported by, and then there's two lines of blanks, so we don't know who those supporters are. Persons such as blank, 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 who hold positions of public responsibility. These people are still being protected.
According to the Attorney General's office, the names are blanked out because the people referred to are still alive.
Well, if people who were supporting the Kray twins in whatever dirty work they were getting up to, along with Boothby and so forth, are still alive and are still being protected, that means really very worrying.
The files will be reviewed again in 2014, but the names of those suspected of being on the Krays' payroll will only be released once they are dead and buried and beyond reproach. Even after more than 40 years, with this scandal at least, it seems the priority is not to serve the public interest, but to protect reputations.